The movie starts and we see 8-year-old orphan Simon, who possesses a remarkable ability. He can assume the appearance of people he has physically touched. One evening, during a bustling carnival, a man indulges in cotton candy at a stand. Afterward, he inexplicably finds himself inside an orphanage, dressed in children's pajamas. Without question, he heads to bed like Simon. Madame Gatron, the director of the orphanage, welcomes a driver who has come to transport the children into town, where they hope to find adoptive families. As the orphans eagerly prepare for their outing, Simon separates from the group and sneaks into the engine room. There, he encounters a young man named Thomas, who has brought cake and wine for himself. Madeline, a girl, unexpectedly observes them from a distance. When Thomas realizes Simon's presence, he invites him to join them for their impromptu meal. Simon confides that he was abandoned as a baby and has grown up in the orphanage. Shortly afterward, the trio hears Madeline's parents searching for their children. In a magical twist, Simon watches as Madeline is joyfully reunited with her father, Jacques, and mother, Agnes. Days later, Madame Gatron contacts Simon and informs him that Jacques' family wants to invite him for a weekend visit. Overjoyed, Simon accepts the invitation and returns to his room, brimming with excitement. When the weekend arrives, Jacques picks up Simon and brings him to their home. That night, Simon discreetly watches as Agnes assists Madeline with her nasal cannula, which aids her breathing. The children have fun playing with flashlights in the dark. The next day, Jacques enters the dining room with a birthday cake for Thomas, who promptly blows out the candles. Simon and Madeline join in, laughing as they do. Following a lively game of charades, the boys challenge Jacques to a pillow fight. Madeline hands Simon the heaviest pillow, encouraging him to take on her father. Jacques suggests that Simon become their blood brother for life, which entails combining their blood and sharing their deepest secrets. Eager to be part of the family, Simon accepts. Thomas pricks his palm and adds his blood to a glass ashtray, followed by Madeline and Simon. Thomas confesses to an innocent secret he witnessed involving his mother, and Madeline reveals her longing for friends, even if her parents believe otherwise. When pressed to share his deepest secret, Simon confesses his extraordinary ability. Despite his strange secret, the three pledge to maintain their brotherhood. Simon demonstrates his transformation ability, momentarily assuming another boy's appearance, before reverting back at Thomas's request. He mentions that his wound from the blood ritual has mysteriously healed, leading him to question if he is immortal. Madeline insists that he keep the scar as a symbol of their bond. Later that night, Simon hears Madeline gasping in her room. When he rushes to her side and holds her hand, he transforms into her appearance, driven by curiosity about her suffering. Suddenly, he experiences the same pain in his chest and struggles to breathe. In response, he reverts to his own form, deeply concerned for Madeline's well-being. The next day, Madeline surprises Simon with a pink raincoat that her mother had bought for him. She unexpectedly kisses him on the cheek, displaying her affection. However, their shared moment is interrupted when Thomas enters the scene, clearly irritated by the matching raincoats. Undeterred, the two boys decide to venture into the woods. Thomas lends Simon his pocket knife, suggesting that Simon use it to dig a tunnel out of the orphanage. Excitedly, they initiate a race, placing a branch on the pathway to mark their starting point. Despite his initially smaller stature, Simon undergoes a transformation, becoming an athletic figure, and races ahead of Thomas. As they continue running, Thomas urgently calls out for Simon to stop, but he loses his footing and tumbles into a deep ravine. Upon hearing Thomas's screams, Simon frantically searches for his friend and stumbles upon the cliff. That night, Jacques leads a search party into the woods to find the missing boys. When Simon observes the distressed family outside the window, he makes a difficult decision to return as Thomas. Agnes quickly opens the door for Thomas, who rejoins the family. Madeline watches as her supposed brother is questioned by the authorities. The imposter recounts the events, expressing concern about Madame Gatron discovering the truth. Worried that Thomas's body might be found, Simon takes responsibility for their disorientation, blaming himself for Thomas's disappearance. That night, Simon enters his new room, with Madeline suspiciously following him. She questions whether he is truly Thomas and inspects his healed wound, leading her to suspect that Simon has vanished. The orphanage staff gathers around Simon's empty grave. Years later, Madeline, now much older, receives medical advice from Dr. Battet about her dietary choices, but she refuses to heed his warnings. The concerned doctor advises her to be cautious about her health, given the long waiting list for a heart transplant. Madeline leaves the hospital in tears, frustrated by her unchanging condition. Meanwhile, Jacques is cleaning his car outside his mirror shop when a young woman enters to claim her order, specifically asking for Thomas. To her surprise, a much older Thomas hands her the package on his birthday. The Durant family and their friends gather to celebrate Thomas's birthday, and they eagerly watch him open his gifts. Jacques, his father, presents him with a mirrored plaque bearing both their names, signifying the passing of control of the family business to Thomas. Madeleine, unexpectedly arriving with her boyfriend on his motorbike, approaches her brother, unaware of her father's earlier revelation. That evening, the family gathers to view Thomas's childhood photos on a slideshow. Unexpectedly, an image of young Simon appears on the screen, taking everyone by surprise. Pleased parents stand behind the scanned pictures, clearly indicating their hidden secret. Later that night, Thomas gazes into his mirror and, for the first time, transforms into his original visage as a grown-up Simon. While wandering around town, he notices a telescope displayed in a store and rushes inside to check it out. However, he comes to an abrupt stop when he sees a blonde woman in the store. Simon hesitates to approach her, slipping back into his own appearance, and quietly purchases the telescope without drawing the woman's attention. Following that encounter, Simon eagerly purchases a plate of fries, missing the taste of the dish due to his impersonation of a man allergic to potatoes. To his surprise, he spots Madeleine staring at him through the glass, recognizing his features. Simon glances aside anxiously, wondering if she realizes who he truly is. When Simon returns home, he quickly changes his shirt as Madeleine knocks on his door. Madeleine is adamant that her childhood friend Simon is still alive and shows Thomas a stolen photo of Simon at a cafe on her phone. Simon, unable to see his own portrait, denies Madeleine's claims, insisting that Simon is dead. Frustrated, Madeleine storms out. The next day, Simon notices a missing persons sign featuring his photo from Madeleine, who is distributing identical flyers to passers-by. Simon decides to buy new clothes while reverting to his previous appearance, pondering a way to stop Madeleine's relentless search. Simon visits the cafe where he was last seen with purpose, only to discover Madeleine discreetly waiting for him inside. Simon takes a seat after catching the woman's attention, and Madeleine approaches, inquiring whether he is Simon. Simon gently denies it, leaving Madeleine puzzled. As she struggles to breathe, Simon guides her outside for some fresh air. As Madeleine calms down, she asks for his name, and Simon responds by introducing himself as Michel. The waitress brings Michel his fries, but he appears irritated by his apathy toward Madeleine's predicament. He pretends to be uninterested while eating his fries. Meanwhile, Madeleine receives a text message from her parents. At the same time, Michel receives a text and responds swiftly before leaving. Madeleine leaves her phone number on a paper plate, subtly indicating her interest. Thomas watches Madeleine at dinner, eagerly anticipating a text from Michel, unaware that she is in the same room as him. Soon, he purchases another phone. The two eventually go on a date at the beach, where Madeleine reveals her hidden retreat. Michel kisses her on their second date. Madeleine guides Michel through the woods to her house and into her room. When Madeleine notices that he is unusually silent due to her intentions, she confides that her days are numbered and kisses him. Upon hearing the Durant family's arrival, Michel rushes to get dressed and leave, but Madeleine insists on introducing him downstairs. Jacques and Agnes greet Michel without realizing he is the same person they have known for years. However, Michel locks eyes with Jacques, who appears to recognize his features. One night while sleeping in the woods around a bonfire, Madeleine confesses to Thomas that she is hopelessly in love with Michel. Madeleine notices Thomas staring at her in the same manner Michel did, prompting her to get up and return to bed. The next day, Madeleine searches through her brother's belongings in search of the identical shirt that Michel is wearing in the lost poster. Michel phones and waits for Madeleine in the cafe, while she suspiciously watches him from a distance. When Michel departs to fetch Thomas's clothing from a hidden rucksack in the woods, Madeleine, unbeknownst to Simon, formerly Michel, watches his transformation from Michel to Thomas, confirming her darkest fears. Later, Michel confronts Thomas in his room, exposing her knowledge of his secret and addressing him as Simon. Simon, distraught, interrupts her outburst and reverts to his natural personality, leaving Madeleine in anguish. When Madeleine recovers, she asks about the whereabouts of her biological brother. Simon leads Madeleine into the deep ravine where Thomas died and encourages her to tell her parents the truth. However, Madeleine proposes to find another way to demonstrate his power, accusing him of being a coward and claiming her parents don't care about him. She vows to find an alternative method as Madeleine walks away. In response to her request, the police, led by Commissioner Leroy, surround the ravine to recover the remains of the deceased youngster. The officer interrogates Thomas in her office, showing him a photo of the Macintosh, and inquiring about Simon. The urn has been placed within Simon's once empty grave since the boy's bones were discovered. Madeleine weeps silently and glares at Thomas, who excuses himself and runs home, knowing it's her brother inside. Thomas gathers his belongings, prepared to leave, believing he has no other choice. However, when the Durants arrive, Thomas believes he suffocated at home due to the shock of Madeline's stubbornness. Madeline points a firearm at Thomas and shoots the ceiling in disgust, threatening to reveal his actual identity. When Thomas takes a step, Madeline shoots him in the stomach, prompting Jacques to seize the shotgun from his daughter, while Agnes summons an ambulance. Madeline urges Thomas to change and save himself from the fatal wound, and as he transforms back into Simon, Thomas claims to be sad and tells the Durants that he loves them. Madeline reveals that Simon replaced Thomas, whom they buried earlier, while Jacques and Agnes back away from the strange guy in horror. Jacques accuses Simon of harming his child as he prepares to leave. When confronted, Simon denies and refers to himself as their father, prompting Jacques to throw him in anger. Eventually, Jacques strangles Simon outdoors as the police approach. To flee, Simon disguises himself as Thomas, surprising Jacques and the bystanders as he seizes the opportunity. Commissioner Leroy attempts to stop the young man, but he quickly drives away with a police car, leaving Madeline in anguish. Simon flees on foot after being apprehended by the police in town. When they arrive at a crowd, Leroy notices a discarded bloody shirt on the ground, implying that the escapee has changed into another person. A month later, Madeline returns her gaze to a police officer standing nearby, fearing Simon is following them. She is startled to discover an elderly man looking at her in grief. She approaches him, seeing him as Simon, but Agnes calls her back. Madeline drops her cane and races towards her boyfriend in his original form, whom she kisses lovingly, declaring her love regardless of who he is. As she returns to her mother, Madeline instructs Simon to take her as they flee, fearing the cops observing them. Madeline, on the other hand, lags and collapses to the ground as her illness worsens. As Agnes approaches, Simon is unable to carry Madeline with his body, so he transforms into Jacques in front of the crowd and dashes into the car. When Dr. Badett arrives at the hospital, he rushes Madeline to the emergency room. Soon after, Commissioner Leroy's troops fled the premises in search of Simon, requesting that everyone's identification be verified individually. While Simon is waiting for an update, the real Jacques arrives and informs Agnes about the police. As the young man transforms into an old man, Agnes tells her husband that Simon assisted her, insisting that they prioritize Madeline. When Dr. Badett returns, he informs the Durants that Madeline requires immediate surgery but is still on the transplant waiting list. Unfortunately, Jacques' heart is unsuited for his daughter, so the doctor urges them to say their final farewells while Simon sobs silently. When Simon notices officers approaching, he flees and disguises himself as a doctor, then steals some medication from the storage room while dressed in a coat. When Officer Dennis stops Simon to verify his identity, the real physician notices him and flees while Dennis is looking for Simon. Commissioner Leroy arrives and demands. Dennis, suspicious of the lady, contacts Leroy but unknowingly speaks to Simon, the criminal. Meanwhile, Simon incapacitates the officer, assumes Dennis' identity, and steals his belongings. Simon, now disguised as Leroy, approaches the guards outside Madeline's chamber and gains entrance for her. Madeline informs Jacques and Agnes that the exits are locked, preventing Simon from escaping. She requests a private moment with Madeline, and Agnes and Jacques leave the room after realizing the true identity of Simon. This allows Simon to reconnect with his dying daughter. The guards are shocked to see the real Leroy when the officer bursts into the room. Upon entering, the officer discovers Simon dead on the bed, clutching Madeline. Leroy finds a message on Simon's hand, urging them to save Madeline. It becomes apparent that Simon took his own life using a chemical. Both Simon and Madeline's bodies are prepared for a heart transplant to fulfill Simon's ultimate desire. Shortly after, the Durant family mourns in the cemetery, placing the urns of their two sons under their respective names. Simon Durant's scandalous past becomes the focus of media attention. Meanwhile, Madeline escapes and begins a new life with her lover's heart. Thank you for watching.